Well, good morning and welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder. This is BRN AM for Thursday, February 27th, 2020. And here are our top stories. Who were the players? We'll take a look at the retirement ecosystem and then a look at expanding retirement security and the impact of the Secure Act. Well, joining me now to discuss this and a lot more, David Levine. He's a principal with the Groom Law Group, an employee benefits law firm based in Washington, D.C. David, welcome back to the program.
Good, Jeff. Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you. Thanks. I know you're out traveling on business. So let's just jump right in. I know you wanted to kind of take a macro look at the retirement industry and kind of define some of these players and who they are. Some people in the audience may not be familiar with some of the key terms that we're talking about. So let's kick it off. Let's go.
Sure. I think for today, we so often when we're doing our Legal Eagles segment on the podcast and everything, we always say, well, this person does this and that. So today, I thought I'd step back and sort of try to frame the world we live in. Because whether or not you're a plan sponsor or a service provider, you don't always necessarily have the full picture. And a lawyer who tells you they know everything is probably making it up too. But I'm going to do my best here to try to do that. Because when you look at the universe of a plan, there's so many different players. You have the employer or the sponsor of the plan. And in the new world of multiple employer plans, you still have the employer, but you might also have the pooled employer plan and the pooled plan provider. So you have sort of the sponsor could be the employer or the pooled plan provider or the two kind of together. So that's the person who says, I want a plan. Then you have the next thing, which is, well, how do you figure out which one to pick? Sometimes people go direct and say, hey, I'm going to call up Record Keeper X. And I'm not here to name anybody by name today. But the idea is they'll go, I'm going to call this company that I've seen, and I want them to take care of my plan for me. Or, which is more and more common, you might have, for smaller plans, maybe a broker. For larger plans, maybe an advisor or consultant. Realistically, the terms get interchanged all over. So it doesn't mean one thing or another. I could get into the weeds, but it's not worth it. But you might have someone who helps you, whether they're a broker, advisor, or consultant, that helps you evaluate who should be your provider, who should be helping you at this point. And they will sometimes say, well, we will help you pick your record keepers, your funds, and all these other things sometimes too, because you have a plan. And what is defined as the plan is sort of just how you save. But there's all these extra services that come in. Sometimes there's student loans, there's wellness, there's all these other things. So first you have the sponsor. Then you have the advisor consultant. Then you also have the service provider who actually runs the plan day to day. That's often called a record keeper, but sometimes it's also called a third-party administrator, and sometimes it's called a third-party administrator and a record keeper. So why the difference? Very easy answer. Because record keepers sometimes will do the full picture, especially on larger plans. But on more complex plans, sometimes smaller plans, what you will have is a third-party administrator. Someone who is a third party who specializes in getting into the weeds and the details that works with your record keeper to actually make sure that everything runs day to day. And then maybe your point of main contact for your plan. Whether you have the two together, one apart, it really varies on your plan. So you're the sponsor, you have your consultant advisor, your record keeper TPA, then you have your investments. What are your investments? Your investments could be done in things like mutual funds, collective investment trusts, and large plans, separate accounts. And there are different people who manage your money there. And the key discussion on that group is understanding who they are and how they're related to each other and what they offer. And then on top of that, you might have someone who says, I'm going to help you pick just participants inside the plan or give you education. It could be managed accounts or some other provider. So you've got all these different pieces. Why should you care? Because it's important to understand you're going to get a stack of paper if you're running a plan and say, you need to sign this and this, and you're going to see all these different names. It's complex to run a plan. And there's people out there saying you can do it simply. There's different views. I'm not going to pick the winners and losers on that because it's not my place and I don't have the ability to. But the idea is to really look at those and say, well, who are we really talking about? And how do we put these together? But what does it mean for the different constituencies here? That's where I thought I would go, Jeff, if that works for you at this point.
I think so. And just to kind of bring it back, this is an ecosystem, and the ecosystem has evolved over the last 40 years, right? And I think that's important for people who are watching this and listening to you, David, that this is something that it's just the way the world, the DC, the defined contribution and retirement world has worked. So let's bring it back and let's kind of break it down for the audience, because the audience could be a participant, but the audience could also be a sponsor or an employer.
Absolutely. So why do we care? I think let's break it down a little bit. Because there's been so much in the news in recent years, and I'll try not to be the wonky lawyer. If you pick up a paper, you've read about fiduciary this, fiduciary that, best interest there. The reality is everybody has different levels of obligations to you. If you're an employer or a participant, it's important to understand who has what roles. The very basic starting point here is that there's no role unless there's a contract. You sign a deal, you buy a house, you sign a contract. For some people, all their duties, because they are not any of these special classes, is just what's in the contract. For instance, your record keeper is not usually a fiduciary. They're not usually an investment advisor. So they're not subject to securities law or necessarily ERISA fiduciary rules. And so what's in your contract controls? And depending on how big your plan is and your leverage and your relationship, you may have different ability to negotiate that contract. And it's important to understand because you're paying money, but someone's going to come fly spec you later and say, did you pay too much? Did you do the right thing? Did you not do the right thing? Then with the consolidation of the industry, just this morning as we're recording this today, news broke that Morgan Stanley is buying E-Trade, for instance. And this consolidation is just an example. It's ongoing. Mm-hmm. But as people consolidate, there's the question of, okay, well, now you're not just doing you're not just helping me pick the plan, but you might have your own product, or you're a record keeper and you might have your own additional services. These aren't necessarily bad, but if it's important if you are the plan sponsor, or even you're an independent third party, like there are service providers who say, I'll take care of this. And as we move into a world of multiple employer plans, the people who pick the providers have to face this too. What are the relationships? Because whether it's contractual, are you an ERISA fiduciary, and for what purpose are you an ERISA fiduciary? Because there's standards there. Are you a securities person? Are you selling product? Are you a broker? Are you a registered investment advisor? If you step through each of those and say, what's the relationship and what's the money flow? People deserve to make money. It's a business. And this is complex and messy. The amount of challenges are hard. I've talked to people who said to me, this makes like some of the complex tech areas in the world look easy. But the reality is that's our system. And how do we make it work? So it's important to walk through those things. Jeff?
Yeah, I've got one question for you. I've got about a minute left before we go to commercial break because we've got a lot to cover on securing data. But at the epicenter, David, and you said this a couple times, I just want to hone in on this point. At the epicenter, at the sun, if you will, of this solar system, this ecosystem, is the fiduciary, is the plan sponsor. He, she, they, the trustees, they have the ultimate responsibility. They need to parse through this information and be astute and be aware of it in order to to ensure that they meet their responsibilities.
I wholeheartedly agree. I oftentimes use the sun mentality with spokes being all the service providers, and there's many more, including us lawyers. One thing I will actually say is it is more important than ever that you go through this and really evaluate who does what and where and what the structure is. Because in the end, it falls back. Even in a map, there's some responsibility that falls back. We're waiting for our guidance from the Department of Labor, but that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah. Well, David, I want to hold you over. We're going to take a quick break. When David comes back, and when I come back, of course, we're going to talk about an update on Secure, the Secure Act, and also we're going to talk about data. So stay tuned right here on BRN AM. Imagine a new television network that will make you richer, healthier, and in control of your financial future. This network is for the policewoman in Nashville, Tennessee, the baker in Dubuque, Iowa, the teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. We want to make the idea of savings and retirement culturally relevant. But what do you see as a defining issue of the midterms, especially for the smaller businesses? I mean, they are the lifeblood of the American economy. Featuring exclusive interviews, current affairs, and docuseries. 33 years old, you retired early.
The philosophy is money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love.
But you got to start thinking about retirement as soon as you get in.
The Broadcast Retirement Network will drive very high engagement with premium partnerships. So this isn't retirement and savings for your parents or grandparents. This is for all Americans. And we're going to change the way you think about money. Welcome to the next frontier of retirement and savings. This is BRN, the Broadcast Retirement Network. Welcome back. We're talking to David Levine, a principal with Groom Law Group. David, thanks so much for sticking around this morning.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. I appreciate the time.
And I know it's early where you are in California. So you laid out the DC ecosystem in segment one. I think that's great. I think it's a great refresher for people or education for people. Let's talk about now Secure, an update on the Secure Act, and also what's going on with data, because this is an issue that you and the firm, Groom Law, have been really tackling these past few months, years, et cetera. So what's up?
Okay, well, let's talk about Secure first. Jeff, you have obviously the consulting background and you touch so many people. One of the things that immediately comes to mind to me on Secure is, what do we do now? There's been so much press. Everybody has said, we did it. It's kind of like, now what? And I think it's important to look at the different segments of your audience and really talk. If it's okay with you, maybe I'll start with plan sponsors.
Absolutely, go for it.
Plan sponsors, a great example. You've read all these articles. You've gone to the webinars. Heck, we've thrown a whole series up there. Yep. What does it mean? Well, first of all, some of these changes are waiting on guidance. So the immediate ones, to me, is you're going to have employees who are turning 70 and a half. If you're an older company, you have people who've been around who retired. Right now, they changed the rule requiring distributions to start from 70 and a half to 72, put in simple English. What does that mean? Well, your record keepers have to get their systems updated. We're waiting for IRS guidance on taxation, reporting all the notices. That's great. You're going to rely on all your providers to help you with this. And as lawyers, we're talking to people. But here's a core thing. If you're a sponsor and you have people who are leaving, oftentimes you do exit discussions. And it's important that you be able to explain, because people are going to read these articles, and the articles are all over the map, and they watch video like you and me right now.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, I'm not supposed to start, but they're probably going to get some materials in some cases saying, I need to start. What does this mean for my estate planning? Because you can't stretch out distributions to a beneficiary. Obviously, an employer doesn't want to be giving estate planning advice. You don't want to be responsible for that.
Right.
But you need to be ready for your employees to say, what does this mean? Because everybody's still getting their footing. So the simple practical advice, and I'd be curious as to your perspective, Jeff, I think right now, if you have someone retiring saying, hey, and who's over like 70 and a half, maybe a little bit of extra messaging, not required, might be to say to them, hey, look, these rules just changed. You might get some paperwork. Everybody's getting caught up. But be aware that if you turned 70 and a half after the end of last year, in other words, you turned 70 July 1 or later of 2019, there's some discussion here. There's some discussion here about when you commence benefits. And I'm trying to keep it simple, but the simple answer is, think about when people have to commence and actually have a real discussion, and be ready so that your people, most importantly, don't give bad information. It's better to be safe and say it's changing than anything else. That's my quick version. Yeah,
and I think you bring up some really good points. And if you have, we talked about the DC ecosystem in the first segment, if you have a TPA, a third-party administrator, if you have a record keeper, if you have some other third party that's helping you with communication, education, perfect opportunity to engage those folks, because like you said, their systems have to be updated, their protocols, their procedures, their people have to be educated to talk about these issues. It's important to engage them.
Absolutely, yes. A number of other things that are out there. But we could spend all day. I'm just going to touch one more, and then we'll switch topics if that works for you.
Yep.
The new rule about childbirth and adoption. There's a rule that says if you adopt a child, have a baby, you can take out up to $5,000 from your retirement plan if the employer's plan allows it. There's a lot of interest in this, but part of it is getting from A to B or A to Z here is hard, because there's a lot of questions about how this works. What if you have multiple children? You're required to allow people to repay money if they leave and take it back, is the interpretation we see at this point. So you put all these pieces together, you're hearing questions. I was at a sponsor just yesterday where this came up as something that they thought people might really push for. So if you're a sponsor, you have to say, Be ready to say, yes, it's out there, but we're waiting for guidance from the IRS, and we need our providers to be ready. Those are the two big things I would put out there. There's other things coming. If you're a sponsor, a big one that comes to mind, two other things just very quickly, is part-timers. If you don't have part-timers in your plan, rules are going to change in 2021. We got some time. The other thing is you're going to see more of an interest in lifetime income, and I talked about the ecosystem in part one. The ecosystem, there's going to be some people who love retirement income, like annuities and plans paying out over time. There's some people who don't. Again, not my place to choose what's right for you. But it's important to step back and say, understanding this, how do you look at this and evaluate it? It doesn't mean you have to do it, but maybe it's worth giving consideration and at least evaluating it with your advisors as you go forward.
Yeah, and before we switch to data, I'll just say, you mentioned kind of spiking the football and saying we did it. We did do it. But part of spiking the football and acknowledging that you completed phase one, there's a big part of phase two, which is the implementation. So people, it's not over. We've got a lot more work to do in a community sense to move this along. So David, I want to shift things now. You and the firm have been doing a lot on data. I know you and your colleague, Kevin Walsh, who's been featured on the show as well. I think you testified in California about CCPA, if I'm not, or CPPA, or
CCPA, you got it.
I had it right the first time. But there's a lot going on with data. So let's talk about that. And we have to give a little plug to Kevin about missing participants, because that is important as well. But let's talk about data.
I want to start with data and how it's relevant to missing participants.
Okay, let's do it.
If Kevin were here, he would do that. Because in missing data, if we have better controls of data, better management of data, maybe it'll allow people to track people. Like, for instance, electronic email addresses and e-delivery. Another discussion we've had, that could help reduce missing participants. But now that we've made our obligatory Kevin joke for today, let me talk a little bit more about data. CCPA in California, California Consumer Privacy Act, without getting really weedy, it requires a notice to people in business who deal with consumers in California. But that also picks up employers and their employees in California. We were active and testified at hearings on behalf of Spark, a trade group, on this exact topic. And thankfully they reproposed regulations recently saying that basically make it a little easier to deal with if you're an employer discussing the use for benefit plans, where you do a notice. We think it makes it easier, but you have to think, do you have a notice requirement? And it's been an interesting discussion because it's often a crossover between us. We do privacy, but we also know there are people who do privacy full time. So it's a crossover between your privacy and security folks and people like us who know our specific area. You bring the two together and it's a collaboration. So if you're a sponsor or a service provider thinking about how you deal with this, that's number one. Number two, the plaintiffs, it's kind of like the Star Wars universe. There's always a next chapter. And if you have Disney Plus, they have a great timeline that was available on their Twitter feed just the other day. This is a long timeline, but the plaintiffs' lawyers are not going away on this. There was a recent case that was filed involving Shell, but it's not about that case. The plaintiffs' lawyers are still digging in on saying, what are you using data for? So I can tell you, I think the industry is actually being very proactive on this. There's a whole debate whether data is an asset of a plan. That's not resolved, and I think there's arguments everybody makes. But if you are, whether a sponsor or a provider of a plan, the question is, what are you doing for security of the data? Security is a different discussion. But also on the data, as part of the negotiation process, it's understanding, what is it used for? What is it not? Everybody here is trying to do right by the participants, and everybody is also running a business at the same time. It costs money to run these plans. So trying to squeeze every provider to zero and have the assumption that everything should be free is not correct. But including it as part of your discussion and understanding the pros and cons of what works, I think that's what we're seeing in the marketplace right now. So if you're a sponsor, to put some concrete spin on it, if you're working with a provider of any name and not just a record keeper, they're the ones who get picked on, but it's everybody. Yep. Ask how the data is used. What is it for? Is there cross-selling? Is there not? And you can use it to document the process. We've done a lot on that. That's what I spend a lot of time on. Similarly, if you're a service provider, understanding what your contracts are, what your related parties do, so you're ready to deal with it. And the question is, how do you price differently? CCPA recognizes that, and other privacy legislation, that the data has value in different ways. And the question is, how do you use that data? And is it something that's priced in? Is it something that's an extra? That's the real focus here. We can go all in the weeds, but it's just about dotting the I's and crossing the T's. In the first segment, I began with, a lot of responsibility is about the contract. In the end, this is just another contract item, and it's important to understand how the world works and use the ecosystem to tie it together.
Well, David, just real quick, we've got a minute left. We, in the end, we've got investment policy statements, communication statements. Are we going to see something like a data policy statement is produced or maintained by a board of trustees?
That's a great question, Jeff. First of all, it's important to remember you're only required to have a plan document. Investment
Sure.
policy statements aren't technically required. People do them, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for another day we could talk about. But and people have done fee policy statements. There's wide disagreement whether they are good or bad, and different clients go different ways. Similar here, to me, it's about creating paper for paper's sake, not necessarily required, but maybe if you're going to follow it, it's fine. To me, the real focus is what do you do process-wise?
Yeah.
So whether you negotiate, review things, watch changing product, that's the way to do it. These plans are complex enough as is. I'm not a fan of creating more paper unless someone knows they're going to follow it. And that's the balancing act here. So I could see more process, but does it have to be a specific sheet of paper? Not in my mind, but it could be.
Yeah, but make sure you're at least talking about it. David, always a pleasure talking with you. And we really, I think we went through the entire Star Wars timeline. We talked about the DC ecosystem. We talked about the Rebel Alliance. We talked about the Evil Empire. And then you brought it home for us with some due diligence. We certainly appreciate you coming on the program this morning. Enjoy your business trip out in California. And we'll talk to you again soon on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
And that wraps up this episode of BRN AM. Have a financial topic or someone of interest that you think we should talk to? Drop us a line. And don't forget, for all the news in retirement, markets, technology, personal finance, and so much more, check out today's edition of The Morning Pulse. So until tomorrow, I'm Jeff Snyder. Keep on saving and don't forget, roll with the changes.